Our crew patch was designed by the daughter of one of our crew members, Carol Lind, Don Lind's daughter. Did an excellent job. We were very pleased with it. While Challenger waited out on the pad for us, we were having breakfast. This is the morning breakfast. You notice we carried the motif of the gold and silver team across. The biggest trick about this was eating breakfast with those shirts on and then packing them up and getting them on board the shuttle so we could have them on board for our crew picture. Exiting the quarters, we all marched off to the van, gave our usual happy wave, and we're ready to go out to the bird.
Since I was a rookie on board, I was asked to describe the sensation of this liftoff. We had an awful lot of training, a couple of years worth, but nothing fully prepared me for the actual sensation of those main engines starting and then eventually those solids lighting. And I'll tell you, this son of a gun really rattles when it takes off. I kept looking out the window, and Bob would say, "Go back to your instruments." So the pilot's job is not to observe, but to monitor and make sure that everything works properly. After we took off, of course, we had a big roll, and something very unique in this picture. In this series of shots, we're going right up the eastern coast of the United States. We'll flash back and forth between this outside of the window shot and the orbiter actually from the ground, but I think it was spectacular. We can see the horizon come up. We're right up the eastern coast. I commented to Bob that we have just gone through some clouds. Those clouds we just went through were at 42,000 feet, so you can tell we were really traveling upward. We had a normal throttle back at about 0.8 Mach to maintain our dynamic pressure below our set limit of about 460 feet per second squared, and then we throttled back up to 104%. Now, we continue up the eastern shore. That camera, by the way, was mounted at my right shoulder, looking out the window to my right. That was the Chesapeake Bay. You can see the Chesapeake Bay. Potomac River there, into the Washington area. Delaware Bay, the Sea Isle coming up on Atlantic City to the right of the screen. The next thing you'll see is Long Island. Certainly doesn't take long to get up there at all. There's Long Island coming up on the right side, and you can see Manhattan there. We'll go right on out the tip of Long Island. See the northern and southern shores out there, the Hamptons. And the next thing you see is Cape Cod. And all of this is real time. This is how fast we were going. Actually, pretty slow compared to our actual flight when we got up to 190 miles. There's Cape Cod there in Boston.
This scene always just proves that the world is indeed round.
And spectacular.
For the first time, we carried aboard a couple of deployables into Getaway Specials, which is really a neat, simple, inexpensive way to deploy small satellites. We were, you can see, I think, the can on the NewSat opening up there in the picture. Unfortunately, we only batted 500 on these, but given that shortly before flight we were faced with perhaps not being able to deploy them at all, we thought 500 was really pretty good. And there it goes. That was the NewSat for the northern Utah satellite, which will be used to calibrate air traffic radars around the world.
When we started down the tunnel, Bob took over the aft flight deck, put the silver team to bed, and this is the rest of the gold team going down into the module to start the various experimental operations down there. It was amazing how quickly we adapted to this sort of locomotion.
Well, review of flying. This is a little bit out of sequence. We didn't get that much fun until about 6th day. What we're doing here is trying to prove in the conservation of angular momentum. That's one of the things I promised my kid to do in the space.
Well, you know, in this case, this is about my 2nd day, and I wasn't sure whether I was going to like flying or not, so I was looking at another profession of juggling. If you watch closely, I didn't do very well with that, but I sure enjoyed the space flight, so I think I'll take the space flight.
Angular momentum is conserved when you don't hit your head or anything.
This was the ultimate fluid dynamics test as far as I was concerned. I was going to do the replay the Joe Allen test that we took only on 35 millimeter on STS-5. I get a little carried away with the strawberry drink. I get the blob flowing well, and I put the straw in it, but I stuffed the straw a little too far through and started sucking it down pretty well, and then all of a sudden it migrated on me and all over my fingers it happened.
This is activating the first of the 3 crystal growth experiments that we had on board. 2 of them were to grow mercuric iodide in the vapor phase. This is the most elaborate of those 2 experiments. The crystal grows in a little furnace behind the gray door with the yellow decal on it. This experiment, we were able to watch the growth of the crystal through the microscope that you see by my shoulder and on the television system. And Ludwig and I spent each shift watching the growth of this crystal. Our hope is to grow more perfect crystals on orbit than we could under the gravitational stress on the ground, so that when these mercuric iodide crystals are used as detectors for X-rays or gamma rays, that the resolution of the X-ray spectrometer is more accurate because the crystals were grown under these ideal conditions. The 3rd experiment was growing triglycerin sulfate crystals in the liquid phase, and this is the transfer of the first test cell in which the first crystal was to be grown. The fluid from which the crystal was to grow had to be heated to a uniform temperature. So we had to transfer the test cell with the ingredients into a preheat chamber where everything would be brought to thermal equilibrium, and I'm just connecting electrical connectors to that test cell. And after everything came to equilibrium, then it would be transferred to the green enclosure below that cabinet, where we could monitor the growth of the crystal with various optical systems.
Well, this part is actually the part that I'm starting to worry about the DDM. For those of you not aware of it, the drop dynamics module did not work when we first turned on. For some reason, we still don't know yet. It was a big disappointment to me at the time. Fortunately, there was no exit. Mine might not even come back at that time. I settled down, start to troubleshooting the system, and with the help of the ground crew and also the support of the flight crew, I was able to get that same system back on track, and we start to operate the system again. And I have to apologize to the rest of the flight crew. When I first turned on after the repair, and I let out such a loud yell and woke up everybody, even started the people in the flight deck. And this is sort of sequence what you will see when the drops dynamics system is working properly. You can see what we're looking at, the rotation of those droplets in a controlled manner. And we can see essentially equilibrium shape eventually lead to so-called saddle point and fission, which it didn't follow through.
This was one of a series of experiments that were intended to primarily look at effects on the nervous system. Unfortunately, the first few days were so busy I did not have time to even touch this. And so, nevertheless, this is what it looks like. It's eye-hand tracking. And really, there's no weightlessness itself produces, as far as we can tell, no real shifts between the two.
Why'd you give up? Right.
What this is about is you have all seen in the previous scenes that Don Lind was installing those crystal growth cells. It was my primary job to actually activate and pursue the crystal growth itself. What you see here in these scenes is a part of the way we could follow the growth of the crystal is by an optical system inside the rack. And what you see, that big black blob there in front of the crystal, is part of the optical system.
On the right here is the RAF, the Research Animal Holding Facility, which is a fancy name for an animal cage in space. And here is one of our friends, and they, if anything, became far more friendly in space than they had been on Earth. I apologize for this. The cage windows were impossible to properly clean and such, but they maintained their same inquisitiveness. That bit of food actually came from above, and he grabbed at it, but they're firmly behind plexiglass there.
This is one of the crystals that we grew from triglycerin sulfate. We started with a seed crystal about the size of a dime and grew it to about 3 times the thickness. My task here was to remove the crystal from the end of the sting, which had already been pulled from the solution, so that we could bring the crystal back safely for transport. It's a fairly delicate crystal, and I had been admonished to do this very carefully, so I was doing it slowly so as not to damage the crystal. Once we got the crystal away from the sting, we wanted to photograph it, and with the white sterile gloves on, we couldn't do it very well. So we simply carefully launched it into space so that Bill could follow with the camera, and we could see all the various facets. You see it has grown under a couple of different growth conditions in various layers above the initial seed crystal.
Everybody's always curious about how you sleep in space. Every crew does it a bit differently. We had these sleep stations, which are really like berths, and they work quite well. There weren't nearly the complaints of backache and insomnia that you get on many flights. I was asked to comment on this section. I'm not sure why. I don't know who that bald-headed guy is.
Well, I don't know if you people have noticed yet that beautiful body there on the left-hand side. One of the things I was involved in was called an Aft Experiment, which required lots of physiological monitoring and recording, and so I have the electrodes placed on my body. That's not all of them that you just see superficially. And then we have underwear that we put right over, and the underwear contains all the wiring and the connectors that go from the actual electrodes to the recorder that later hangs on a belt on our waist. And you see I'm trying to get that stuff on, and it's all the wires are just hanging loose right now, but they all fit somewhere and they all go somewhere, I can guarantee you. And that's how we got dressed every morning and undressed every evening, and that was it.
Bob and I spent a lot of time taking photographs, but a part of my job was to document what went on. I thought you might like to see what the tunnel looked like between the orbiter and the space lab after we had stowed a lot of the trash in it. It looked like kelp kind of floating around. That was my hand, by the way, trying to keep me straight. We have a little joggle here where we actually raise up and come into the tunnel, and that gives you an excellent view of the space lab back there. I'm at the other end now, and I'm going to move up, and in just a minute you'll see how things get passed.
All right.
There it goes. You can see the pen.
Look at that.
And that came from Don Lynn all the way to Ludwig at the other end. That's about 20 feet or so.
Yeah.
Ludwig's working at the workbench there.
Right. And you can see how all the wires are now fitted to connectors on my arm, and there is not much hanging loose from, that white underwear that I wear. I worked in my T-shirt, as you can see. I hope you will forgive me for this informality.
Norm not only slept in the bunk, but in a moment you'll see where he really slept.
Well, it turns out that up by the scientific airlock is a nice little nook or cranny or whatever, and I got up there before Ludwig realized where I was, and I said, "Hey, Ludwig," and Ludwig says, "Who said that?" And it took him about 5 minutes to find out that I was up there.
It looked like a moray eel coming out of there.
This is the Aurora, the northern, or in this case, the southern lights. This is really one of the spectacular views of a natural occurrence on Earth. To see the whole sky illuminated below us against the moonlit clouds was really spectacular. This goes from horizon to horizon. The atmosphere is bombarded with electrons coming in from the magnetosphere, and currents surging through the ionosphere cause the air particles to glow. This is taken with a black and white television camera for sensitivity, but to see this in full color was really spectacular. Plasma instabilities in the plasma caused the motion. Bob took 35mm pictures to document the color because the various color tells us the particular particle that's emitting light. The red shows a particular transition in atomic oxygen. The green, a different transition.
Well, this was deactivation. At long last, although we were having such a good time, we had to come home, so we battened down the lab, prepared it for entry, and this is closing out the airlock hatch that goes back into the space lab just prior to getting ready to start the deorbit procedures.
Everybody strapped into their seats. This is the last experience that Taylor was going to have to get with zero gravity there, is playing with the amplifier box. This was one of our displays, the backup flight system on CRT-3. Just, you can look on that and you see we're counting down to entry interface, and it was a very relaxed entry. We were absolutely nominal. You notice I kept sitting there with my hand on top of my helmet with essentially nothing better to do but just watch it at least down to Mach 0.9.
Yes, except the rest of us didn't know you were doing that, or we would have been more worried. There's
what the glow looked like out my window on the left. This is up probably Mach 22, 23 yet. We had done our deorbit burn in nighttime, and so we saw our last spectacular sunrise as we came on our track in towards Edwards Air Force Base. We were still very high, the glow was around us, and all of a sudden the sun started breaking through, and of course it washes all that glow away totally because the sunrise is quite spectacular.
Bob got the glow, I got the sunrise.
These are the mission specialists, Norm right to the foreground and Don in the background, and then Fred there at his pilot seat. And we're just, we've now moved into daylight. You can see this, we're banked over quite a bit at the bank, looking at the Earth. It's amazing how at 200,000 feet, after being up at 190 miles, at 200,000 feet flying over the clouds of the Pacific, we thought we were right skimming the tops of them. They just seemed like they were right below us. It's amazing how coming down to that altitude, and here we were a good 140,000 feet above them. We intercepted the heading alignment circle at 0.9. We had really nothing to comment on. The entry was absolutely nominal. We'd picked out the lake bed way out over the Pacific. Fred had called that he could see he had a visual on Edwards when we were well a couple hundred miles off of Los Angeles. We passed over Los Angeles and then on into the heading alignment circle. We picked up all of the visual aids. The guidance was right on. Houston had assured me several times that guidance was showing us right on track. Fred made the normal calls that we have trained so much in the standardization of all the flight crews, the pilots making the calls and the commander flying here. And as we come on down, at 400 feet, we lowered the gear. I'm sure Fred lowered the gear without even me calling it. And we came on down to touchdown.
Bob, I want to just say that this was one of the most superb touchdowns I've ever had in my life. We didn't even know we were on the ground.
Well, we rolled for a while there, got the speed brakes to come out and start the derotation down. And got on the brakes at that time after derotation in accordance with our test plan, and brought it to a stop. I've got a couple of pictures that I'm very proud of that for test pilots, it doesn't make a lot of difference where you land, but it's where you stop it, and we stopped it right on center line, and we made darn sure we got it stopped right on center line. We felt very comfortable. I don't think any of us had much deconditioning experience to go through. We were obviously feeling heavier, but we walked very steadily and had no difficulties with it at all. We did not want to make a walk around because I had been doing some braking, heavy braking intentionally as part of the testing, and did not want to walk around in case the tires had gotten hot. Again, that was the flight of 51 Bravo, Space Lab 3.